Emmett Till by Jessica McBurney, 2016. Emmett Lewis Till, 1941 to 1955, was a 14-year-old African-American boy from Chicago who was lynched in Mississippi after reportedly flirting with a white woman. The injustice of his murder inspired many in the civil rights movement. Lynching refers to killing someone for an alleged offense with or without a legal trial, and the act is often linked to angry mobs and race. As you read, note the racial climate of the South in which Emmett Till was killed. Emmett Till grew up in a middle-class, predominantly black neighborhood in Chicago, raised by his mother, Mamie Till. In 1955, he was 14, but because of his stocky, muscular build, everyone who knew him said he looked like an adult. That summer, his great-uncle, Mose Wright, traveled up from Mississippi to Chicago to visit Emmett and his mother. When Wright returned to the South, Emmett begged his mother to let him tag along, to visit the rest of the family. She relented, but sent him with a warning. Mississippi is very different from Chicago. Make sure to behave yourself around white people down there. Emmett agreed he would. Flirting with danger. He arrived in his uncle's hometown, Money, Mississippi, in late August. One morning, Emmett and his cousins stopped into a local store where they encountered a young white woman named Carolyn Bryant. She and her husband, Roy Bryant, owned the store. Earlier in the week, Emmett had bragged to his cousins about the white girls he dated at school in Chicago, so they dared him to say something to Carolyn as she sat behind the counter. Accounts vary as to what Emmett said to her. He may have whistled, touched her hand, or asked her on a date. Whatever it was, Carolyn responded by running outside to retrieve a pistol from her car. When the boys saw the gun, they ran away from the store to avoid more trouble. The murder. Roy Bryant heard about the incident a few days later and began questioning black men around town to find out who had done it. He eventually traced it back to Emmett. Bryant and a friend, J.W. Milam, broke into Mose Wright's house in the early morning hours of August 28, 1955, and demanded to know who had harassed his wife. Emmett confessed. They threatened to shoot him, told him to get dressed, and led him outside to their pickup truck. Bryant and Milam drove out of town, stopping twice to beat Emmett severely. According to a later interview, their original intent was to beat him up and leave him on a riverbank, just to teach him a lesson. But as they continued to beat him, Emmett called them names and insisted he was just as good as they were. Presumably, out of anger, they drove to the edge of the Tallahatchie River, shot Emmett in the head, tied a weight around his neck with barbed wire, and threw his body into the water. Later that morning, Emmett's Uncle Mose called the authorities and reported Bryant and Milam for kidnapping. They were arrested shortly thereafter, and Emmett was presumed still missing. The funeral. 3 days after the abduction, a fisherman discovered Emmett's body in the water of the Tallahatchie. The corpse was so disfigured from the beatings and from being in the water so long that the only way it could be identified was by a ring on Emmett's finger bearing his initials. When Mamie Till found out about the murder, she insisted that the body be sent back to Chicago immediately, whatever the cost. When she saw Emmett's mutilated face and body, she also insisted they hold an open casket funeral so everyone could see the worst effects of racism in the U.S. Tens of thousands of people came to see Emmett and show their support for his mother. Newspapers across the country carried the story. The trial. Bryant and Milam stood trial for Emmett's murder in late September 1955. Lawyers for the defense argued that the body was too disfigured to be properly identified, and they claimed Emmett was probably still alive and simply had not turned up yet. Mose Wright testified against his nephew's murderers, the first black man to testify against white men in the state of Mississippi. The jury was all white men. After listening to the facts for 5 days, they deliberated for 67 minutes before concluding that Bryant and Milam were not guilty. One juror said in an interview, "If we hadn't stopped to drink pop, it wouldn't have taken that long." Just 1 year later, in 1956, Look magazine interviewed Bryant and Milam, and they gave their account of the murder for the very first time. They did not speak during their trial. They had admitted to everything, including the shooting, and filled in many details from the story. Milam explained why he felt he had to kill Emmett. "Chicago boy," I said, "I'm tired of 'em sending your kind down here to stir up trouble. I'm going to make an example out of you so everybody can know how me and my folks stand." Throughout the interview, the two men never showed any sign of guilt or wrongdoing. In their minds, they had done what was right to protect their families and their country. They were heroes. Mamie Till later confirmed that they never regretted what they had done. He said he would do the same thing over again to whoever got in his way. I felt sorry for him. A symbol for civil rights. Reactions to the feature in Look shed light on the complex race issues facing the country in the 1950s. Letters to the editor fluttered in, some congratulating the interviewer's bravery. One preacher from Ohio wrote, "You are to be complimented for your willingness to stick your neck out in this manner for the sake of justice." But others condemned the piece. By this example of opinionated, baseless reporting, Look itself pays scant recognition to the traditions of American justice it claims were ignored, said one Mississippi reporter. Another writer defended Bryant and Milam, saying they did what had to be done, and their courage is to be commended. To have followed any other course would have been unrealistic and cowardly. Reactions like those across the South prompted people to understand the need for greater equality between blacks and whites. Emmett Till's murder became one of the most important catalysts of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. When Rosa Parks famously refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Mississippi in December of 1955, she later said she had been thinking of Emmett and the injustice he had experienced. Her actions sparked the year-long Montgomery bus boycott, which brought the civil rights movement to the national stage. 2 years later, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which set up protections for black voters and established the Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department. Federal officials could now get directly involved in cases where civil rights were being abridged. Later, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended all forms of segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination. Mamie Till, who passed away in 2003, understood the significance of Emmett's death. She herself became actively involved in empowering black youth in Chicago, but the pain of her son's murder never left her completely. This is what really started the civil rights movement. That's what everyone tells me. But I was not trying to start anything. I was just upset that my child was gone, and so needlessly.